The title of my talk is the United States and Homegrown Jihad, and there's a good reason for that, because that's the only jihad we really need to be particularly concerned about, in my view. And so let's start with the big picture. Why is it that we should only be concerned largely with the homegrown threat rather than the foreign threat? And basically that takes two forms. The first is our defensive capabilities, and the second is our defensive capabilities. So let's start with our defensive capabilities. On 9/11, there were 16 people on the no-fly list. Now there are 40,000. There are also 700,000 on a larger list of people that are identified as being potentially linked to terrorism. On 9/11, the FBI and the CIA barely talked to each other. There was the wall, which Karen is writing a book about. That, of course, no longer exists. On 9/11, there was no DHS, which is the second largest kind of entity in the federal government other than the Pentagon. On 9/11, there was no TSA, which may be sort of a mixed sort of thing for some people. But the point is that no terrorist in their right mind is going to try and get some sort of weapon on a plane in the United States. On 9/11, there was no National Counterterrorism Center, which Matt Olson so ably led for many years, and Mike Leiter before him. On 9/11, the FBI was, you heard Director Comey saying there's always been an intelligence organization. That's true. But it's certainly a much better intelligence organization today because of people like Phil Mudd and others, and conceives itself as an intelligence gathering organization, has a huge analytical capability it didn't have before 9/11. On 9/11, there were 32 Joint Terrorism Task Forces. Now there are 104. We learned today from FBI Director Comey. The point is that the United States, and also, by the way, the intelligence budget has tripled since 9/11 to today. It's now roughly $80 billion. It was roughly 25 and change on 9/11. So, you know, the United States government has made a huge effort, and it's largely succeeded. I mean, it's very hard to attack the United States coming from the outside. And then add to that our offensive capabilities. We have imposed enormous costs on al-Qaeda. What better witness for that than Osama bin Laden himself, who was writing these lengthy memos about how the drone program was decimating his organization, how he'd run out of money, how the al-Qaeda brand was in deep trouble. He was even thinking of how the drone program had just decimated most of the leaders of the organization. He was even contemplating sending his organization to Kunar in eastern Afghanistan, which is very mountainous and heavily wooded and very hard to survey from the air. He was advising one of his sons to move to Qatar, which is one of the safest and of course, richest countries in the world. The point is that between these defensive capabilities, which make us a very hard target, and then our offensive capabilities, we took a giant sledgehammer. And yes, the group has metastasized, and we've heard a lot of that discussion already today. And in fact, of course, al-Qaeda and its affiliates exist in more countries than they did on 9/11. But is diffusion a sign of strength or not? And I don't think it's a sign of anything necessarily. Because when al-Qaeda was most concentrated in one country, Afghanistan, before 9/11, that's when it did the most damage to us. So the mere fact that there are more affiliates around the world doesn't necessarily mean anything to me. Of course, ISIS is a big problem, certainly for Syria and Iraq, and I'll get to kind of what threat it may pose to us at the end of my talk. But the point is, we're a hard target. Al-Qaeda is very weak. So that leads us then, the natural conclusion is who threatens us? Well, it's groups it's individuals influenced by these ideas who live here. But their capabilities are rather low. So, but before I get to that, just a couple of data points. If we'd had this discussion in 2003 and I said that 26 Americans would have been killed by jihadi terrorists in this country, over the next decade or more, you would have said that's impossible. But that is what has happened. So each of these deaths is an individual tragedy, but they're not national catastrophes or anything close. And in fact, right-wing terrorists, and we don't call them terrorists, but they're killing civilians for political purposes, have killed significantly more people in this country than jihadi terrorists, at least 38 by a count at New America that I've done with some colleagues. And that number is almost certainly an undercount, because right-wing extremists kill a lot of people for other reasons other than political reasons. Also, just because they're violent people and they're involved in crime. And it's also almost certainly an undercount because these are very local stories. Look, if you do the thought experiment where a small school shooting, somebody shouted Allah Akbar in the middle of it, it would be a giant national story. And school shootings are now so routine in this country that they barely register unless there's a large death toll. The point is that these right-wing kind of extremists who are killing cops and people they consider to be enemies, or Jews or Sikhs, these tend to be pretty local stories compared to a jihadi terrorist attack. So the point is that we've really managed the problem. Now, politically, it's very hard to say that. The only reason that President Obama could say the real problem is homegrown and a certain amount of threat to our facilities overseas is a speech he made on May 23rd, 2013 at National Defense University. The reason he could say that is he's a second-term president. You will not hear Hillary Clinton or Jeb Bush or whoever runs on either ticket saying that we've essentially managed the terrorist problem, even though it's true, because the political costs, as we saw with Benghazi, with an attack that could be any way linked to Al-Qaeda in any way that came to this country would be very, very high. So politicians are not going to say what I'm going to say, which I think anybody in the national security business basically recognizes to be true, which is basically we've managed the problem, and we can't quite declare victory because terrorism as a tactic's been around forever, but we have managed the problem. And so let's look in detail at the problem as it exists today. In a database that we've assembled at the New America Foundation where I work, 252 jihadi terrorists in this country. Now, how do you get into the database? We exclude people that are associated with Hamas or Hezbollah because Hamas and Hezbollah doesn't attack the United States, doesn't subscribe to a philosophy of global jihad. We also exclude people who get eventually charged with things like visa overstays. It's only if you're involved in terrorism, material support, some attack, some plot. And we found 15 things. Once you look at these 252 individuals, there are 15 things that we found, and I will quickly run through them. First of all, they're overwhelmingly male, which is not surprising since these are a bunch basically of misogynists who don't believe that women should have much of a role in anything. There are some females in there, 13. We know some of Jihad Jane was mentioned by Dina Temple-Raston, Afia Siddiqui. There are others, a woman called Shannon Connolly, who was a 19-year-old who tried to join ISIS just recently. But they are a distinct minority. It is a very mixed ethnicity. There is no profile, and something that Director Comey said. But let me give you the numbers. 21% from Middle East or North Africa, 18% from South Asia, 15% Somali extraction, 10% Caucasian, 8% African American, 3% Hispanic, 2% Uzbek, and some others that are unclear. They are overwhelmingly American, interestingly. And so, because of 9/11, it was basically a bunch of foreigners came and attacked us. We tend to think of terrorists as being basically foreigners. But this sample shows, in fact, that 4 out of 5, when we can identify their nationality, are either US citizens or residents. They are not the young hotheads of popular imagination. Their average age is 30. Just under half are married and have children. They are also not stupid, which is probably not surprising, because by definition, if you are trying to be a terrorist, it doesn't help if you're a sort of functional idiot. They are better educated than most Americans. Now, this, by the way, this is changing a little bit. But I think the people who are joining ISIS tend to be less educated. They tend to be younger. But I'm giving you the picture since 9/11. 2/3 of them or more graduated from high school, as opposed to about around half of Americans. 15% did graduate study or attained a graduate degree, as opposed to 10% of all Americans. So they are slightly better educated than most Americans. They have very high unemployment rates, which is like at 5 times the average American unemployment rate. 1/3 are unemployed, and so you ask yourself, why are these smart people unemployed? Well, it turns out that being a jihadi takes up a lot of time. If you're running a jihadi website, it takes a lot of time. If you are, just obsessed by the jihad, it's gonna naturally, there are certain kind of jobs that you're not gonna get. You are certainly not going to be, well, look, by the way, most companies' vacation policies don't extend to you popping over to Somalia or Pakistan for a month or 2. And so it is hard to have a normal job. And also, if you subscribe to this ideology, you're going to not work in a bank, because it charges interest. You're not going to work in a restaurant because alcohol and pork are served. You're not going to work in a place with women who are uncovered, or in your view. You're not going to work in a place where women are around who you aren't directly related to. So automatically, there is a whole set of jobs you're not going to do. So the unemployment rates are very high. 1/4 of the sample of this 252 are converts. That is a little less surprising than it might seem. It seems like a high number, but in fact, Many Muslim Americans are converts. I think the number is close to a fifth. A quarter very active online presence. And when we say active online presence, it's not sending emails, it's running a website, it's having a very active Twitter feed, and of course, or sending encrypted emails, this kind of things. 60% self-recruited. I think that number is going up. In only a quarter of the cases was some individual, the impetus for some other individual to join the jihad. We found 8% had some kind of mental issue. That makes them about as sane as the general population. Which again sort of makes sense. If you're completely psychotic, I mean, the hatchet man clearly had mental issues. But as a general proposition, to organize some kind of terrorist plot, it doesn't help if you have serious mental issues. NIH says a quarter of Americans at any given moment could be diagnosed with some mental disorder, and that at any given moment 6% have a serious mental issue. So on average, this is a group about as sane as the American population. They are not career criminals. Only 11% spent time in jail. That 9% of all American males spend time in jail at some point in their lives. Almost none radicalized in prison. This is because you may go back a few years, there was great hysteria in the United States about people being radicalized in prison. We found only one case, about 1% of the total. A very big moment for these men, mostly men, is the decision to travel overseas. Just over half tried to travel or did travel overseas, and that's a crucial step that takes you from being just a fundamentalist in some cases to being a militant. One really fascinating takeaway, given all the hysteria that surrounded this issue, in not one of these 252 cases did anybody try to build, acquire, develop chemical, biological, radiological weapons. Think about, we went to war on this issue in a sense in 2003, that the terrorists would arm with weapons of mass destruction. So jihadi terrorists just don't engage in this kind of thing. You may remember that Graham Allison had a book out in 2004, basically terrorists going nuclear. He predicted that within a decade that there would be a terrorist nuclear strike on the United States. Well, it is a decade later, and nothing even remotely like that has happened. And this gets to a larger issue, which is there is no penalty for saying the sky is certainly going to fall and then it doesn't fall. It's much harder to say things are going kind of okay because given human nature, something un-okay will likely happen at some point. But the point is that there's been a great sort of industry of the sky is falling and very little evidence to show that there is. On the issue of chemical, biological, radiological weapons, the people who are using these weapons, who will deploy them, who are deploying them, are right-wing extremists. We found 13 cases since 9/11 of right-wing extremists. We found one left-wing extremist, and we found 2 people with idiosyncratic motives, and I include in that Bruce Ivins, whose motives were very murky, the anthrax attacker. Military targets are the target of choice in about a third of the cases that we looked at. There was a plot to attack a soldier or a military base. And the influence of Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen born in New Mexico, was very high. In a quarter of the cases we found the militants had his propaganda, including 18 cases since his death. So even in death, he remains a pretty influential figure. So that's a little bit about who are these cases, what the kind of person is in these cases. A couple of other points about these cases. How are these cases made? Because there's, the whole issue about NSA surveillance at the end of the day was this is effective because it can keep you safe. Well, it turns out that the NSA phone surveillance, which is the thing Americans most cared about, the fact that the government kept 5 years of their phone metadata and just in a blanket way, only solved one case. And it was a case in San Diego where a guy who was a cabbie was sending money to al-Shabaab in Somalia. So that's one case out of 252, it's less than 1%. And it's, of course, we don't want to encourage people to send money to Shabaab, but if the entire fruits of this very controversial program is $8,000 that was sent to Shabaab, was detected, it's a pretty small fruit. And in fact, it turns out that the way that most people get caught is actually very conventional law enforcement methods. Family and community tips. Peter King suggested that the Muslim community was not sort of stepping up to the plate a few years back. That is completely false. In fact, family and community tips are in a third of the cases, and we just saw this case in Colorado where the father dropped a dime. The fact that the 3 kids were trying to join ISIS is a kind of classic example of that. So family and community tips provide a lot of these cases. NSA surveillance under 702, which is the less controversial kind of surveillance of overseas email, generated about 5% of these cases as far as we can tell. There may be more. Informants produce 17%, routine law enforcement, 5%. Some people self-disclose, like this guy, Don Morgan, who showed up in Beirut and was interviewed by NBC News and explained that he wanted to go to Syria to fight. And suspicious activity reporting produces about 8% of these cases. Anyway, the bottom line is that conventional law enforcement techniques, pretty unexotic stuff, is the stuff that actually usually stops people from doing these kinds of plans. Two other quick takeaways. There is a sharply declining number of indictments. Now, declining indictments isn't a perfect measure of declining threat, but in 2009 there were 46 indictments, in 2010 37, and since then 2002, 2013, 2014 we're seeing about 15 or 16. The number of indictments in 2009 was probably influenced by the numbers of Somali Americans going to fight with Shabab to some degree, but the point is we're seeing a falling number of indictments. We're also seeing very rarely any links to foreign terrorist organizations. And also, the other thing, we're seeing no groups, because then nobody in their right mind would say, hey, I'm going to set up a large group of like-minded jihadis that would be very easy for law enforcement to detect. So it's individuals or pairs, often with no links to a foreign terrorist organization. Now, there are exceptions. Mona Abu Salah from Florida, who did join up with al-Nusra and did commit suicide for them. But by and large, again, this is, I think, getting to the point that we've had a very effective law enforcement effort because people don't want to form groups, that they're worried about informants, and they're self-radicalizing in individuals or sometimes in pairs. And just in conclusion, I just wanted to address the ISIS returnee threat. There's been a vast amount of sort of hyperbole surrounding this. I mean, let's start with the fact that 12 people have gone. This is not a large group of people to join ISIS or Nusra. 2 of them are already dead. Mona Abu Salah committed suicide for Nusra. Douglas MacArthur McCain was killed fighting for ISIS. And the Syrian civil war is really dangerous. And when you go over there and you have no idea about how to handle yourself in a battlefield, you're almost certainly going to die. I thought it was very interesting that Director Comey this morning said that I think to quote him almost directly, we have a reasonably good handle on this, on the people we're going. Of course, we don't know what we don't know, but that's always true, right? I mean, but there has been a huge American law enforcement effort and all of our allies to get a grip on this problem. And it relates back to kind of something I should have said earlier, which is the biggest force multiplier in all these things is public knowledge. So go back to what I said right at the beginning about like the defenses we have and also the offensives, and then add public knowledge, because on 9/11 there was no public knowledge this is a problem. So it was the passengers who disabled Richard Reed on the flight from Paris to Miami a few months after 9/11. It was the passengers on Northwest Flight 253 who said, look, there's a guy whose smoke is pouring out of his crotch, there's something wrong with this picture, and they went and they disabled him. It was the vendor in Times Square on May 1st, 2010 at 6 p.m. who said, look, there's an SUV, smoke is pouring out of it, went to a cop, and that was Faisal Shahzad's attempt to blow up Times Square. So the point is public knowledge is a huge reinforcer of all the things I've just described. And this is also analogous to what I'm talking about with this foreign fighters, because during the Afghan war, we had no idea this returnee issue would be a problem. And in fact, bin Laden had an office on Atlantic Avenue. It was called the Services Office. And I interviewed people there in 1993, and they mentioned it was called the Services Office. And it was only like a decade later when I reread my notes and I knew what the Services Office meant that I really understood that's actually bin Laden's office in Brooklyn. So we had no idea, the larger community, public, law enforcement, had no idea there was going to be a problem. We understand that the returnee problem is a big deal, and we have really put a lot of effort into it. And we've already run this videotape twice before. There was going to be a big returnee problem from the Iraq War, the first Iraq War. It didn't really happen. Now, obviously, we're getting a lot more Europeans going. But we've run this videotape with the Somali Americans, whether it's 30 who went or 40 who went. None of them have come back and fomented terrorism in this country. A lot of them died in suicide attacks or were killed in Somalia. And the Syrian problem is different because it's all across the country. It's not focused only on the Somali American population, largely concentrated in Minnesota. But the point is that there is no ipso facto reason for people who go over there to come back and attack us, particularly when they're being tracked by a very aggressive law enforcement effort. So in summary, we have managed the problem pretty well. And we're more than 10 years after 9/11. And it's because of the work of many people in this room that we're in this place. And it's hard to have this discussion as a political matter, but I think people who have a real interest in national security need to be frank about what the level of threat we face, particularly people in my situation. I mean, if you're a government official, obviously you're paid to be worried about these things and should be. But I think as people who are trying to comment on this or have some expertise in this, we have a sort of duty to go out publicly and say, this is a problem we manage. It makes no sense that 2/3 of Americans believe that ISIS is a serious threat to this country. That doesn't make any sense. So, I mean, yes, they pose some kind of threat, but they don't pose a serious threat to this country. They pose a serious threat to Syria and Iraq. And I don't want to be sort of very parochial, but at the end of the day, we're in the United States. We care about our national security more than others. And basically, we have managed this problem pretty well. So I'll take any questions. Phil Hashcorn.
Hi, Peter. Not sure I heard you correctly, so I just want to ask, because you blew through a lot of statistics very quickly.
Yeah.
The 252 jihadis that you and the New America Foundation have in your database, which, by the way, I'd love to see that, were all of those people subject to some sort of criminal charges? That's question one. And number two, did I hear you correctly say that you counted 26 deaths at the hands by jihadis here in the U.S. since 2003? Could you elaborate on that if I heard that correctly?
Well, I would have said 21 about 3 weeks ago, but there is this case of this guy who went on a killing spree in New Jersey and other parts, and I think his name is Muhammad Ali Brown, and we've added them in because he did seem to be, we haven't added Hatchet Man in yet, because it's still a little unclear, but the point is that we have to, so, a month ago I would have said 21, 13 at Fort Hood, 2 at LAX in 2002, 4 in Boston, and there's one other case in Seattle where somebody attacked a Jewish community center. So, but the numbers are very low, whether it's 21, 26, or higher. In terms of how the database is publicly available. If you go to the New America website, it doesn't have all the information I've just outlined, but a lot of it. You get into the database because if you're indicted, convicted, and we've added some people that we have good reason to think they would have been indicted or convicted, but are dead. So, for instance, Tamla Nsane is in the database. That is a relatively small group of people, maybe a dozen people who were never indicted because they died before they could be indicted. And if you get acquitted, we take you out of the database. And the interesting, of course, you never get acquitted. I mean, the numbers of acquittals are 1%. I mean, if I was, Josh Dortel is here, he's one of the leading defense attorneys in this country. It must be a pretty tough conversation to have with your client because you're like, if you go to trial, there is a 99% chance you will be convicted. That's pretty high. I don't know what it is in other sort of standard criminal cases. I'm presuming it's pretty high, but not at that level. So, so does that answer your question, Phil? Yeah. This gentleman here.
Thank you, as always great to hear you talk. What do you make of the differences culturally in the other societies where there are large numbers of jihadis coming? For example, in Europe, from the kind of study you've done on those coming from the United States, which is relatively small. And I think about the movie that was done about Afghanistan years ago where it had a person was involved in a terrorist act in Washington who later decided to become a mujahideen in Afghanistan and then resurfaced in, I think, the movie Kandahar. But I'm just curious about what you make of these cultural differences in these other societies and socioeconomic causality.
Okay. Yeah, one of the striking things to me is like how little terrorism there is in Europe. You've got a bunch of, it's like the population of Muslims is much larger. They are much more discriminated against in every sense. Here's an interesting factoid. 10% of the French population is Muslim, 70% of their prison population is Muslim. They have every reason to be doing terrorism all the time. And yet there's no terrorism in France. I mean, the last time there was a terrorist attack in France of any significance was in 1995 when somebody attacked the Paris metro. There have been other smaller attacks, but the point is it's pretty infrequent. And so why is that? I mean, and I think, you know, the French have a pretty aggressive counterterrorism policy, but I'm not seeing massive waves of, you know, the last significant terrorist attack in Britain was the 7/7 attack, and we've seen a couple of other incidents, the murder of the soldier, Mr. Rigby. We've seen a stabbing of a member of parliament by a female who was influenced by what she was finding online. But the point is that there's just not a lot of terrorism in Europe either, which I find sort of interesting and slightly surprising because having grown up in Britain, you know, a Pakistani in Britain is not the second-class citizen that they were 30 years ago. I mean, but it's not a, you know, there is no British dream. There is no French dream. There is no EU dream. The American dream does work pretty well, certainly for Muslim Americans, which who are you know, much better educated and have higher incomes than the average American, don't live in ghettos. But so the point is it's surprising to me. You'd have thought there'd be more terrorism in Europe, and there isn't. So.
Mr. Bergen, based on what you just said, where would you put the Uyghur experiences in China, not only in Xinjiang, but I think in China there have been more successful homegrown attacks in the past year than there have been the past 5 years in the West?
Yeah. Well, I am going to make a prediction that the Chinese will use drones against Uyghurs who are many of the Uyghur terrorists are based to some degree in Afghanistan, and that in the next 2 or 3 years we'll see a Chinese drone attack against Uyghur terrorists living in Afghanistan, basically using the same rationale that we do, which it is okay to use violence across borders against groups that we consider terrorists if the host government isn't doing enough to deal with them, which is our rationale. The reason I say that was I think the Chinese announced in 2013 that there was a drug lord who kidnapped 18 Chinese sailors, and he was holed up in some remote part of Myanmar. And they said, we are contemplating killing him with an armed drone. They do have armed drones. In the end, they captured him alive. The point is that our enemy, or people that we certainly don't consider friends, we didn't have a single armed drone in the United States until the fall of 2001 that could actually kill somebody. Our monopoly on that is evaporating. And so the rules of the road that we have created are rules of the road that we either have to feel very comfortable about the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians, all of whom have armed drones now, using, or we need to come up with some kind of international framework about the use of violence across borders in countries that are not at war for the purposes of killing terrorists. Right now, we've created a lot of norms. So I'm just saying the Chinese, who do have this Uyghur problem, and it is real, I think would be very easily be able to say, hey, these are the same norms that you've applied.
You've said Al-Qaeda is dealt with, is very diminished. ISIS is not a big threat to the U.S. However, a very recent UN report says that people from America, Americans, Europeans, Australians, thousands in an unprecedented scale are joining ISIS and other militants. Yeah. Aren't you worried when these people will come back, at least in the medium term?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say there's no threat, and clearly we saw in Brussels on May 24th that somebody who fought in Syria, his name is Mr. Namouche, he killed 4 people. But the Syrian civil war is already into its 4th year, and that is the only example that I'm aware of any Western attack by somebody from Syria. So yes, it will happen, but that's the only attack. Then one other quick thought on that. The parentship of ISIS is Al-Qaeda in Iraq, basically is the same group. Now, does anybody in the room recall any attack by Al-Qaeda in Iraq outside of Iraq that was directed at an American target? I mean, there is an example, but there's only one example, and that is the attacks on the 3 American-owned hotels in Amman, Jordan, in 2005. And then after that, they didn't do it. So there's also no reason to necessarily expect, or that you can't, again, if you're in the government, you have to plan for the worst case. But Al-Qaeda, ISIS, despite all its sort of public fulminations, may not have really the desire or ability to really pull something off substantially against an American target. It's hard to prove negatives, but I don't see any evidence of that kind of planning. In fact, quite the reverse. I mean, if Al-Qaeda, really interesting, they have this sort of in-flight, ISIS has its own little in-flight magazine in English called Dabiq. And if you read Dabiq, D-A-B-I-Q, and it's now issue 4, it is exactly the opposite of Inspire magazine that was put out by AQAP. There's nothing in there, or almost nothing about building bombs in the kitchen of Imam and attacking the West. It's all about coming to do jihad here. And actually it says the only way to do jihad is to come here. So, you know, if they were serious, they would have taken Mona Abu Salah, who after all did come back here and was completely unknown to law enforcement until he came back and talked to some FBI informant. They would have sent him back on a mission to attack here, and they didn't. Similarly with Douglas MacArthur McCain, who would have been, you know, pretty African-American guy, grew up in Minnesota. You know, instead they used him as a sort of a battlefield fodder. So I'm just not convinced that it is the threat that is being portrayed. And unfortunately, we've convinced a lot of our fellow citizens that this is a huge problem. And by, you know, unless I'm missing something, I don't think that is really a rational response to the set of facts that we know to be true. Sorry, if you start with you. Okay, good, go ahead.
Thank you. We had a definition describing a little bit of the differences between Al-Qaeda and ISIS.
Yeah.
One without borders and one within the state. My question is, what is their victory if we have to come to them? I mean, they certainly don't look welcoming, and we don't enjoy Sharia law. How will that happen? Is there a time frame, a timeline to what is the victory? What is the goal? What kind of end do they see? If it's not Laban's room or something else, what is it?
What does victory look like? You know, I mean, I think that ISIS is destined to make this. It is inevitable that they will make the same set of mistakes that these groups always make, which is, you know, 99% of the world's Muslims don't want to live under Taliban-style rule. There's nothing like living under the Taliban to have a healthy skepticism about their promises of bringing utopia here on earth. And if you look at Afghanistan, there's no huge groundswell for bring the Taliban back. So the point is, everybody knows the Taliban doesn't really deliver anything and excludes half the population from any form of work or education. This is what these groups really want to do. They want to impose Taliban-style rule. It is the seeds of their own defeat. And we saw in Mali, which we don't discuss today because it's basically in the rearview mirror, you know, the Malians were, when the French came in January 2013, and they had half the country, it was the size of France, they were greeted as an army of liberation. And this is part of the French Empire. We saw in Anbar that AQI disappeared because of the same kinds of, you know, local uprising added to the US military. So I think that in the long term, the prognosis for ISIS is poor. They seem to have learned from their mistakes. It's the first jihadi group in history that seems to have learned from its mistakes. They are doing services, but they are also imposing Taliban-style rule. They are, you know, ruling like Stalin is really effective if you just keep it up. And so I think one thing that suggests that they may be around for a while is they will they're being very brutal, but over time the local population is going to chafe. They will ally with others. And by the way, ISIS has made a world of enemies: the Kurds, the Yazidis, Shia, Sunnis who don't precisely make the alliance we have against them is pretty large. So I think the prognosis for them is pretty poor. Okay, yeah, last question.
Hi, thank you for speaking at this event today. There was a recent survey that was conducted that noted via law enforcement agencies that the greatest threat they viewed was homegrown terrorists, i.e. the sovereign citizens movement, and then Islamist fundamentalist terrorists and militia groups, nationally based militia groups topped it out for the top three. Your study that you've done kind of puts to rest the intensity of the threat of Islamist jihadism to the United States from external threats and internal. At what peril do we focus so much on the external potential, the potential for an external threat, that we ignore these domestic terrorist threats?
Right. Well, I mean, I'd answer it in a slightly different way, which is like, you know, Yogi Berra famously said, you know, it's hard to make predictions, particularly about the future. And so, you know, we don't, but I can guarantee that whatever the big problem that we're going to have is something we aren't expecting. And we've created this giant Maginot Line, highly effective against the thing that attacked us on 9/11. But I think we will look back on it as a Maginot Line that was built up at huge cost. And let's say, and you know, and rightly so. But whatever else is going to come is not going to be just some version of ISIS, you know, with the ability to do some mass casualty attack. It will be aerosol, it will be an Ebola that is carried through the air, or some other thing that we're not really expecting. So on that sobering note, thank you.